All right, let's just talk this morning on why indexing sucks. Now, this will be a little bit longer video than normal. It was kind of an interesting conversation I had the other day, but it brought to life what's wrong with people who look sometimes at query plans or SQL Server's advice on you need to build this index or you need to build that index, and this whole approach that indexing, if we build an index, the query will speed up, heavily depends on the type of environment that we're in. For instance, that is generally going to be the best solution or a better solution for an OLAP or a heavy read environment. That may be true. Okay, in an OLTP environment, that is probably the very opposite. You want minimal indexes. In fact, as a case in point, I was talking to a colleague a couple of weeks ago, and he was mentioning that he's in an environment where there are no indexes at all. None. And, he was just like, this is so weird. And I was like, well, describe the environment. And so as he described the environment, I was like, oh, yeah, you wouldn't want to build an index in that environment. I have a lot of OLTP with Bitcoin loans and stuff that there's no indexes on at all. A table scan is good. The reason is it's optimized for inserts, it's optimized for updates, it's optimized for deletes. Selects are second priority. I don't want anything interfering with that. Indexing is not a solution to problems. It's not a solution to problems at all, depending on what the problem is, right? It can be, it may not. More often than not, if something is going slow, I'm trying to think of a situation in which, in looking at the query, it couldn't be tuned further, but pretty much more often than not, a query can be tuned further by digging into how the query is written and rewriting it. There are very few cases where I would start at the index level, or I would start at even the updating statistics level. The first thing I'm going to look at is, let's see how the query is written. Let's get the same information from the query, but let's see how it's written. A great example, I'll tell you one that I see time and time again with how people write queries, is they're applying filters too late in their query. And it's like, no, you apply your filters early. The goal is not to get a million records and then later filter. It's to get the minimal amount of records that you need, right? And to filter that first, because that's going to be fast, and then do your later filtering. A good example is someone will let's say, do a remote query to get a million records, and then they're going to filter through those million records later in the query. Instead, it's apply your filter on the remote query first to get your 1,000 records that you just need, and then apply filter. That's just one of those, and you see this time, for me, I see this time and time again. It's like that's terribly written because you're applying your filters later, and it's just thinking about it. And by the way, when it comes to tuning things, if a robot could do it, if you're just going to buy software that's going to make recommendations all the time, then we don't need you, right? I mean, think about it that way. It's like I was trying to tell this one developer. It's like if a software program could do everything that you do, then we don't need you. Then get lost, right? Like that's why you hire people, because they're creative. So if you just want a software program to do all your work for you, well, you're not going to have a job in the future. And there are robots coming, and they're going to be taking a lot of your jobs. So you may get what you want, only you're going to find out that that's not what you want later on. Okay, I've also seen just bizarre effects in general by writing queries in different ways. One of the most bizarre that I've ever seen, it was the only time it happened, but I mean, surprisingly, a temp table beat a CTE and a subquery. Select star into. That was just weird, but it worked, and it was super fast, and the difference was 1 minute versus less than a second. So before using an index, which is very costly, I think that updating statistics is a better approach because it's much less costly. Then reevaluate, as this is much less costly than creating a new index. And sometimes it is statistics that are the underlying problem. Consider when creating an index as far as cost. There's going to be maintenance overhead added associated with it. It may not work for every query or query plan or parameter, right? So it may be skipped. This is why when you see, you'll add an index that's suggested, and I've seen people do this, and then they turn around and they look at it a week later, and there's a new index that's suggested, and now the other one's not being used. Okay. Also consider availability groups and indexing maintenance configuration. Again, there's maintenance cost associated with indexing. And then, of course, if you don't do it in a certain way, with the way you build some of your high availability disaster recovery, might be problematic. Indexing also uses space. It's not free, right? It uses space, and then finally, the index may not even be used, right? So this isn't to say that indexing is not the solution, and there are definitely query plans. If you see a table scan, and you know for a fact that there should not be a table scan. Notice I said you know for a fact that there should not be a table scan. In many OLTP environments, a table scan is great. But if you know for a fact that there should not be, then an index can help, right? But there are many situations when an index is not going to help. You're going to have to understand how to write a query, how to filter appropriately, how to reduce the amount of joins you make. I mean, if you're starting to push above 3 joins, you're already going to create a nightmare for yourself. Okay? Just understanding math and permutations there. So that's the starting point. And as a great example of this, just to kind of wrap up, in the last, I would say, 3 environments that I've been in, over 95% of the queries that we have taken from either several minutes or too many seconds to under 1 second, 95% of them have involved just rewriting the query. And it's just like, let's look at what we're doing, let's look at this, and a lot of that comes from the query plan or the statistics, right? That means that only 5% of the time I'm either going to be updating statistics or reindexing. So the solution to the problem had nothing to do with an index, and the solution to the problem had nothing to do with updating statistics. Right? That's what a junior DBA would recommend. You're like, oh, we're gonna add an index, or we're gonna update statistics. Like, no, right? Rewrite your queries. You got to be good at writing queries, and I know it's true. A lot of people point this out. They've said this to me. I'm one of the rare DBAs that knows how to write T-SQL very well, but there's a lot of DBAs out there that don't know how to do that, and that's a huge disadvantage, because if you don't know how to write stuff, you don't know how to write your queries, you're going to be disabled when you get into these situations and you add an index, but that's going to add overhead. And then you see, like, for instance, in one of the environments a couple of months ago that I saw, where, I mean, they had hundreds of indexes per table, and they were using 2, and the rest of them weren't used. So they're just consuming space. I just, well, the query plan changed over here, and now it's got to learn how to write queries. Okay, so that's my advice. By the way, if you're using Entity Framework, I know people love Entity Framework because they don't need to hire a DBA, right? The problem is, more often than not, if it's an Entity Framework environment, the queries just are awful. I don't agree with whoever said, oh, it does 80% or 70% of the things right. I don't agree with that. You know, that's spoken like a non-DBA. So that's my take on it. But for the most part, if someone comes to me with, we need to add an index or whatnot, 95% of the time they're wrong. It's only 5% of the time indexing or statistics is actually going to be where it is. You got to learn how to write queries. When you learn how to write queries, you'll be able to solve a lot of problems without changing any index structure, or without updating statistics as often as you think. And then the other one too as well is, you may end up finding that you can end up removing a lot of your indexes, which then end up saving resources and space.